Last time. In the 70s, Lester Eubanks sat on death row, convicted of murdering a 14-year-old girl.
My father knew that he was guilty, and Lester knew that he was guilty.
Then one day, in the span of hours, Lester went from prison inmate to wanted man.
It just emboldened him to believe, I'll never be caught. And he says, all you got to do is smile.
What police didn't know was that their fugitive had taken a bus across the country and started from scratch in Southern California with a brand new identity. I'm Sunny Hostin from ABC News. This is Have You Seen This Man? Lester Eubanks had a new name and a new home, a fishing license as his ID, and a 10-speed bicycle as his transportation. It took some effort for authorities and our team to retrace his first days of freedom. For that, we find senior investigative reporter Matthew Mosk and ABC News investigative chief Cindy Galley climbing into a dusty attic in the New Mexico desert.
Oh, wow. A lot of space.
Cindy and I found ourselves rooting around a cavernous warehouse attic in one of the most desolate spots in New Mexico.
This is fun.
It was like a scene out of American Pickers or Antiques Roadshow. All around us were boxes and crates and file cabinets stacked on wooden pallets.
This is like a this. It really is.
You can look at the size of some of those file cabinets.
We were hunting for evidence left behind from Lester's life in L.A. with one of the first people to hire Lester after he arrived there in 1974, just months after his escape. She's a street-smart woman with wavy white hair and a big laugh, Joy Springer. Joy moved here decades ago to escape the bustle of L.A., but back in the 70s, she was living and working in a section of Los Angeles called Gardena, which isn't far from LAX. She was a manager at Quality Quilters, a factory that made mattresses and waterbeds. About 50 people built the furniture from scratch on a cement production floor. Joy did the books and the hiring. One day, a muscular man in a tank top with no socks and little black slip-on shoes sauntered in looking for work.
It was right in the beginning of the waterbed era, and we were going big guns. You had a heartbeat, we'd hire you and put you to work. We run in 2 shifts.
The man said his name was Victor. He went by Vic. At the time, no one was looking very hard for Lester. Initially, Mansfield police knew he was headed to the Los Angeles home of a relative named Kay Banks. The FBI had searched Kay's house almost immediately, but they showed up too soon. Lester was still on a cross-country bus. An FBI agent from that time told me the LA office was large and busy, and without new tips coming in, the case would have soon been labeled pending, inactive. Back in Ohio, it seemed everyone forgot about Lester. His case was so inactive, we could find very little record of police activity for well over a decade. Hearing nothing, some people in Mansfield assumed he had been caught and was back in jail. James Banks, an Ohio civil rights attorney who knew Lester's father, told me and my colleague Alex Hosenball that he thought there was an obvious reason the manhunt was lackluster.
Do you think if the victim was black, wasn't she?
Yes.
Okay, do you think if she'd have been white that it would have been lost?
Do you think if she had been white, I'll put the question back to you, there would be dogs, there would be helicopters.
Oh, they'd be out there. Yeah, they would have never rested. They'd still be out there today. You know, if he...
But there were police in town who had not forgotten about the middle school girl who was murdered, Mary Ellen Diener. In the early 1990s, the National Criminal Information Center, where crime data is shared around the country, was upgrading its computers. John Arcudi, a retired Mansfield police detective, remembers the day in 1993 when he was asked to go check and see if Lester's escape warrant was still posted.
We checked the computer to make sure that he was entered, as a wanted fugitive, and he wasn't even entered in the computer as an escaped felon, a federal fugitive, any type of crime that he was wanted for in the National Law Enforcement Database. Therefore, suppose he gets stopped for speeding or whatever, he could give the police his real name, and when they run him through the computer, he's going to come back fine, that there's no wants or warrants on him.
Arcudi reopened the search for Lester. He began to track all the numbers Lester's father, Mose Eubanks, was dialing. So if Mose called a number in San Antonio, Arcudi would ask local police to identify the recipient. Arcudi would then fax over copies of Lester's file, always making sure to note the distinctive scar Lester had on his upper right arm, a long, fleshy slash. Mose dialed the phone, Arcudi's fax would go out to Fort Wayne, Indiana, Muskogee, Oklahoma, Vancouver, British Columbia. In those days, Arcudi lived at the fax machine. But then he thought of a more efficient approach.
We talked about it, and we decided, well, let's do something. Let's get hold of America's Most Wanted and have him do a segment on him.
Enter John Walsh.
It seems hard to imagine, but less than 30 years ago, the murder of a young girl was a rare crime in this country.
On September 10th, 1994, the intense, no-nonsense host of the True Crime Show aired a segment on Lester's case.
But what happened that night shocked the whole town.
Reenacting the crime and reigniting the manhunt.
And the nightmare continues to this day for Mary Ellen's family. This summer, the Deaners gathered to talk about...
And the tips came pouring in? I mean, what was the reaction to the show?
Overwhelming. The first time it was on America's Most Wanted, I think we ended up with over 100 tips that came in. And one of those tips was very fruitful.
It came from a woman in Florida.
She knew him. She knew him in California.
The woman called the tip line to say her ex-husband had socialized with Lester in Los Angeles in the 1970s. She was the first person to tell police Lester had, all this time, been living with Kay Banks. Arcudi followed up with the woman's ex-husband, and he not only confirmed the story, but also heard about Lester's life in L.A. The man said Lester mostly hustled, making a living playing cards, gambling, and leeching off women. And he remembered Lester was using a name, Victor. The call was a break, a big break, and Arcudi immediately reached out to the Los Angeles Police Department's Fugitive Squad. Cindy and I got on the phone with Tim Connor, who used to be a member of the squad. Now he's the police chief in a town near Dallas.
We wanted to record this, if that's okay, so we had a record of everything. Is that all right with you?
Yeah, that's fine. Just bear with me. Remember, it's been over 20 years, so...
Chief Connor said L.A. was a popular destination for fugitives.
It was fairly sizable. That we had a lot of people think that they could come, and a lot of them did, come to a city of millions and just become an anonymous person and hide, amongst the millions, and many did. They were on the run, and they knew that it was a place where they could come where, they could blend in, and the weather would be nice, and they could try their hand in a new place to avoid capture or avoid sentencing or avoid any number of things.
But joining a manhunt 20 years after the prisoner had escaped, that presented some unique challenges.
So he had a sizable and considerable head start on attempts to locate him. And Lester was not a stupid man. He knew how to stay low. He knew how to avoid contact. He knew how to not bring attention to himself, and so he was very successful in the Los Angeles area. And I say the area.
Still, their investigation quickly began to pick up Lester's footprints. The detectives made their first contact with Kay Banks. She told police Lester turned up at her front door out of the blue. She remembered the moment he arrived, when he moved in close to her, whispering his new name. "My name is Victor," he said. "My name's Victor Young." Los Angeles, a place people went to reinvent themselves. At first, for Victor, it wasn't glamorous. Each morning, he would ride his 10-speed bike to work in Gardena, about 4 miles away from Kay's house. Joy Springer remembers those summers. It was hot in the waterbed factory, with no air conditioning, and he and the other men worked long days with their shirts off. When it rained, she would give him a lift in her Toyota Celica. She never knew exactly where he lived. At his request, she would always drop him at the curb. And when he was in the car, they would sit quietly with the radio on.
My recollection, he didn't really say all that much, I don't think. He wore a lot of cologne, and it would give me a migraine. It would give me a headache, so it was always like, okay, put the window down.
Victor was quiet and blended in at the warehouse.
You know, he came into work every day, neat, clean, he was on time. I mean, those are things that were important to me in an employee. Neat, clean, on time, and be there. And he was. And he was pretty accurate and able to comprehend and pull the orders.
Initially, when she saw the America's Most Wanted episode, Joy wanted to double-check her old photo albums. And she realized something.
Because one of my business partners, she took pictures of everybody, everything, and he was not in any of them. Not one. We would take the whole crew to lunch at Shakey's Pizza. He was never in any of the pictures. We would do a monthly birthday party, piñatas, cake. I mean, believe me, we had a lot of fun. He was never in one of those pictures, ever.
Victor never left a mark, except when he was filing shipping forms and doing paperwork. Then Victor had an unusual habit.
He wrote his name on clipboards. He wrote his name on file cabinet drawers, file folders, trays.
In black marker, with fancy script, he scrawled his signature on everything. Much later, she realized it wasn't idle doodling. He was practicing his new name.
Is there anything on there?
On the clipboard.
It's those clipboards that took us up into the attic at Joy's offices in New Mexico. She was sure they were there somewhere.
I don't know where it got put back to. It's an old brown wooden one, not these plastic clipboards that they have now.
As we searched, Joy told us Lester only spent a year or two at the waterbed factory, but he stayed in Los Angeles. Police tracked him to a different job as a hospital custodian, a position he apparently held for years. But the hospital has been sold multiple times since then, and records are scarce. Lester also found an apartment during that time in South Central.